Good afternoon, and thanks for joining. On behalf of myself and my collaborators at the USGS, Point Blue Conservation Science, Stockholm Environment Institute, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, as well as the Nature Conservancy and our NASA funders, I want to thank you and the organizing committee for this opportunity to share our team's work. The goal of this project was to integrate a non-spatial, climate-driven hydrologic model with a spatially explicit land change model to help us examine alternative stakeholder-derived land use and climate scenarios and their impact on future waterbird habitat in the California Central Valley. So why is waterbird habitat so important here? Well, the Central Valley is one of the primary stopover points along the Pacific Flyway, with millions of waterbirds overwintering here. However, only 10% of original wetlands remain due to intensive human land use and water diversions over the last 2 centuries. Remaining wetlands are mostly privately owned and operated as managed wetlands or through intentionally flooded cropland, making optimal long-term management of these habitats a high priority. California has one of the largest and most complex water supply and delivery systems in the world, which supports a $50 billion agricultural industry as part of the 5th largest economy in the globe. An estimated 2% of water supplies in this highly engineered landscape go to environmental flows or for waterbird habitat, and droughts regularly afflict the state and are projected to be more common in the future. So understanding potential future limitations on water resource availability will be critical for continued management of flooded habitat to support these waterbirds. And water availability is a clear concern. Recent work by Ryder et al. Shows significant declines in open surface water during the recent drought, indicated in these graphs in gray. And this is compared to other drought years since the year 2000, indicated in green, as well as non-drought years shown in purple. And this is for 3 different crop types indicated on the left, as well as wetland types indicated at right. The largest reductions that have been observed have occurred from October through March, but decreases have occurred in all months. And comparing the most recent drought to longer-term climate trends paints a very startling picture. Temperature trends in California show a clear warming over the last 120 years. Drought severity indices show longer and deepening drought conditions over the same period. And it is unclear if the current drought in the western United States will match the intensity and duration of the 2 near 200-year droughts recorded in the paleo record. Yet it's important to note that since California became a state in 1850, its infrastructure and economy has evolved during an anomalously wet century. Research indicates that the most recent drought may have begun as early as 2000 and is ongoing, despite a few above normal rain years. And even in the absence of anthropogenic climate trends, the 2000 to 2018 period, indicated here in blue, would still rank among the 11 most severe prolonged droughts in the reconstruction. So we know water limitations are ongoing and could continue into the future. And water demand in urban areas is also likely to rise, as 10.5 million more people are projected to live in California by 2060. And the population could double by century's end. Many estimates project these new residents will settle in these inland counties that make up the Central Valley. And before I get into our future projections of land change, I always like to examine land change that has occurred over the past 100 years before we try to look 100 years out. Here is a 1901 street map of Sacramento, followed by a zoom in of modern Google Earth imagery, followed by a zoom out of the broader region of the same 1901 area indicated in yellow at center. And you can see from this, a lot can happen in just a short amount of time or a century. So part of our work, we wanted to capture the combined impacts of projected future human land use, future climate, and future water availability in this region, which required model integration between the non-spatial WEEP Central Valley model, or WEEP CV model, and the spatially explicit Lucas model. Our goal was to produce annual maps of future land use and the probability maps of both fallowing and potential flooded cropland habitat across a range of scenarios, out to century's end, or the year 2101. And we produced these at 270 meter pixel resolution. Here is a brief look at the inner workings of the WEAP model. WEAP simulates stream flow, runoff, water demand, and water supply for flooded habitats by both basin and what are called WEAP zones. It creates simulations based on climate projections, as well as decisions about water use priorities. And those priorities were informed by our stakeholder scenario development. It is a scenario-based water resource and habitat modeling tool used widely in the Central Valley. And here is a conceptual diagram of the Lucas State and Transition Simulation Model. For each of our 270 meter simulation cells, we were attributed these by region, WEAP zone, and county, as well as initial land use and land cover. WEAP outputs for each scenario were calculated by each WEAP zone and fed to the Lucas model as both deterministic annual land change transitions and as transition probabilities associated with temporary fallow or flooding conditions. Lucas guided the spatial placement of change using probability surfaces to either promote or disallow specified land change or flooding conditions. We developed 32 monthly flooding duration probability surfaces and a fallow multiplier using historical remote sensing data, as well as probability surfaces for perennial expansion, wetland restoration, and urban development. Lucas produced annual maps and tabular outputs, as well as average annual transition values summarized over 30-year periods for each transition group. Our scenario narratives were developed as part of the Central Valley Landscape Conservation Project, and we worked extensively with stakeholders and managers, and also conducted field trips to various wildlife preserves to identify the biggest drivers of change. We developed 4 scenarios based on 2 axes of uncertainty: water availability along the vertical axis and management for conservation on the horizontal axis. High water availability was associated with the warm-wet climate future driven by the CAN ESM 2 8.5 model, while lower availability was tied to a hot, dry climate future modeled using the HADGEM 8.5 model. The 5th scenario is a historic business as usual, or BAU, using historic climate projections. Scenario acronyms are labeled on the outside of this figure, and each scenario identified water prioritization for both wetlands, winter flooded cropland, orchards and vineyards, stream flow, and indoor and outdoor urban water use. All of these were parameterized in the WEAP model. The Lucas model ingested each scenario output from WEAP and produced annual land use and land cover maps, simulating permanent changes associated with urbanization, wetland restoration, and perennial expansion into annual cropland and grassland. Here is a movie example from the historic BAU or HBAU scenario simulation. This shows decadal changes from 2011 to 2101. Notice the widespread expansion of perennial cropland in dark brown and the expansion of development or urban spaces in red. Here we see a graphic of the gains and losses in land use and land cover over the 0 center line. So anything above 0 is gains and anything below are losses. Overall, perennial expansion, indicated in brown, represented the largest land use and land cover change in the simulations and across the scenarios, with similar increases of about 4,000 square kilometers across the historical BAU, the bad BAU, and the dream scenario. And this was at the expense of about 3,600 kilometers lost cropland and annual cropland, with the potential to be flooded, which is essentially our waterbird habitat, indicated in purple, as well as declines in the grass shrub, indicated here in yellow. Development trends were relatively similar as expected, given the rates of development were held constant across all 5 scenarios. This resulted in roughly 2,300 square kilometers of newly developed land on average. Wetland restoration was applied in the HBAU, DREAM, and EEM scenarios. And in the hot, dry scenarios, Shown in the right two panels, they show similar change, but roughly half the losses in both potential flooded cropland and other annual cropland compared to the three wetter scenarios on the left. The relative warm and wet climate, coupled with lower competition for expanding water-intensive perennial crops, drives this variation. This series of maps shows scenario agreement in where those losses of cropland area that could potentially be flooded, so potential habitat, where losses in those areas occurred. And this is in 30-year increments, moving from left to right. The loss of dark blue between these maps indicates 5 scenarios agreeing with the potential loss habitat. Again, these losses were mostly driven by conversion into perennial cropland, which is cropland that is not flooded to support waterbird habitat. It must be noted that only a small proportion of this lost cropland is actually flooded in any given year. Land use transition probability maps summarized across all of 5 scenarios show regional variation in future change, as well as scenario agreement on where change is likely to occur. The higher probabilities in these maps are darker colors, indicate high scenario agreement and a greater likelihood from left to right of fallowing, urbanization, perennial expansion, and wetland restoration over the simulation period. In the wetland restoration map, the dark areas are just indicative of non-wetland areas. And in the 3 maps to the left, the black areas indicate existing urban areas prior to model onset. Note the Tulare Basin, which is located in the southernmost part of the study area, had the highest probability of fallowing and higher concentration of high probability urbanization occurring. New development is also region-wide and as is widespread perennial expansion. Most prominent in the southern Tulare Basin again, and in the western San Joaquin Valley. Newly restored wetlands were modeled mostly near existing refuge complexes throughout the region. And clear variation in each scenario is seen when we look at these 30-year annual average probabilities of January flooding by itself. So this is January flooded habitat at the end of the century in the Sacramento National Wildlife Refuge Complex, which also includes the Gray Lodge Wildlife Area. And this is in the northern Sacramento Valley, so the north part of our study region. And here, flooded cropland is more prevalent, and probabilities of habitat being flooded were highest in the HBAU and BBAU scenarios, and they were lowest in the EEM, or everyone equally miserable scenario. And this is despite the EEM scenario's high prioritization of water for both wetlands and cropland, and the relatively limited expansion of perennial crops on potential flooded crops. In all cases, and irrespective of climate future, there's less water available for habitat compared to present day conditions. Looking at the cumulative January probability in 2101, or at the model end, and this is averaged across scenarios, you see regions most likely flooded for habitat, as indicated by the 4 inset map regions encompassing from north to south. Item A is the Sacramento National Wildlife Refuge. B is the Delta region. C is the Grasslands Ecological Area. And D is the Kern National Wildlife Refuge. When you combine the net change in flooding as compared with the historical average at left, plus losses of potential habitat due to land conversion at center, the result is an overall picture of scenario-based projections of total flooded habitat change at far right. Losses of flooded habitat were prevalent across scenarios and the model period and increased over time. The hot, dry climate scenarios, the EEM and dust in orange and brown, were least impacted by land use change overall, meaning despite less water available, lower perennial expansion meant relatively less cropland was converted, but less water also drove greatest declines in January flooding in these scenarios. Overall, climate-driven loss of water availability had a greater impact on the probability of habitat being flooded over the losses of the actual potential habitat available from land conversion. So some of our key findings, perennial expansion really leads a lot of these trends for land conversion and losses in potentially flooded habitat. And in warmer, wetter scenarios, assumptions by our scenarios and our stakeholders about more water being available drove higher rates of land change. And by century's end, the greatest declines in the probability of flooding were modeled in the hot and dry scenarios as expected. Lower water supplies means less availability, and this is even despite lower land conversion and demand for water from other land uses. In all scenarios, future declining habitat was prevalent. And I'll end with my contact slide and information and a list of publications, data releases, and our story map, and open it up for questions. Thank you.